Ну, наверное, вот здесь вот на весь экран, да? Понятно. Ну, давайте, давай.
Chers amis, chers collègues, bonsoir. Merci à vous toutes et tous d'être là, d'être venus. Je suis ravie de vous voir à la 7e réunion de séminaire de l'Institut de philosophie indépendante. Notre association internationale, Institut de philosophie indépendante, est fondée par des philosophes russes qui ont quitté leur pays en désaccord avec la politique militaire des autorités et la guerre en Ukraine. L'Institut a 3 missions principales. Il mène des études critiques en philosophie, en sciences humaines et en sciences sociales. Il soutient les chercheurs qui ont été contraints de quitter la Russie. Il développe des projets de recherche conjoints avec des collègues du monde entier. Nous cherchons des réponses aux 3 questions globales suivantes. Quelle est la logique historique et sociopolitique des événements qui se déroulent sous nos yeux? Quel rôle jouent les écoles et les traditions philosophiques nationales dans le monde contemporain? Quelles pourraient être les contributions de la communauté universitaire pour sortir de la crise actuelle? Aujourd'hui, c'est la 7e rencontre de notre série de séminaires mensuels. La série s'appelle « Les outils philosophiques dans l'analyse des défis contemporains ». Pourquoi? Depuis le siècle de Lumière et le célèbre débat sur les philosophies populaires, la philosophie a été plusieurs fois confrontée à la question de son utilité auprès d'un large public et la question de sa capacité à fournir des réponses aux défis contemporains. Est-ce que cette philosophie populaire peut conserver son caractère systématique ou bien elle doit se réinventer méthodologiquement pour résoudre des problèmes spécifiques? Au regard de la perspective d'aujourd'hui, cette question semble plus permanente que jamais. En plus, la complexité des problèmes posés par les crises politiques, économiques et existentielles menace la stabilité des structures démocratiques et provoque des changements sociaux rapides. D'une part, nos séminaires visent à appliquer les outils philosophiques pour analyser une diversité de problèmes interdisciplinaires contemporains. Cela englobe les évolutions récentes et en cours dans les domaines socio-politiques, ainsi que la découverte scientifique et les tendances culturelles. D'autre part, il s'agit d'étudier les phénomènes du monde moderne et les replacer dans le contexte de l'histoire de la philosophie. Cet objectif est également une tentative de répondre à la critique croissante selon laquelle la philosophie contemporaine s'intéresse principalement à des problèmes abstraits détachés des questions de la vie réelle. Nombre de nos sujets sont associés à la Russie, car les événements survenus depuis février 2022 ont beaucoup influencé le paysage politique et intellectuel international. Les séminaires sont aussi en direct sur Zoom. Il est très important que nos collègues qui ne sont pas à Paris puissent assister virtuellement et participer à la discussion. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes en présence de M. Sergei Medvedev, qui parlera de la bioéthique du soir et de la necropolitique de la guerre, des usages du biopouvoir dans la Russie de Poutine. M. Sergei Medvedev est un historien russe spécialiste de la période post-soviétique. Il enseigne à l'Université de Prague et travaille à la radio Liberté, où il anime quelques émissions populaires, dont archéologie. Cette année, il a également publié 2 livres, Une guerre made in Russia, édition Bûcher-Chantel, et Biopouvoir dans la Russie de Poutine, édition Browse Books en anglais. Sergei, je vous cède la parole. C'est à vous.
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais parler en anglais. Mon français, j'ai étudié français à l'université, mais je n'ai pas parlé depuis 30 ans. Et je pense que ce sera mieux pour toute l'audience que je parle anglais. Pour moi, mieux l'exprimer. So let me speak in English. And it's really an honor, a big honor to be presenting here en Sorbonne. It's just as my French friends told me, it's like a linguistic honor, because normally not dans la Sorbonne, but en Sorbonne, it's like I say, like in a country, in an academic republic. So really, I'm very grateful to Julia for this invitation, for the opportunity to speak in this venerable edifice in these halls. And actually, it's also a special pleasure because I'll be dealing theoretically from a methodological point of view with ideas also developed here in Paris by Michel Foucault. The idea of the biopolitics, of biopolitics, as was devised in his late period in his lectures at Collège de France, and then it was later emerged through his writings. And also some post-Foucauldian thinking was also developed here in France. So it treats on the book which you see here, which my co-author Andrei Makarichev and me we have co-written over the past years, and which is just getting published. It will appear in the bookshelves this summer in July 2024, called Biopower in Putin's Russia, From Taking Care to Taking Lives. And indeed, it is born out of a sense of surprise, because about 10, 12 years ago, we discovered that the center of Russian politics, of political discourse, is gravitating towards the realm of the human body. This was quite surprising, because if you look at the late Soviet Union, and especially at the post-Soviet affairs, you would see that the domain of private life was largely left to the individual. The state retracted from these interventions of the spheres of human sexuality, of food habits. Russia in general was, and by and large it still is, a largely permissive society. It's not Iran, right? It's not even Poland, with a strong Catholic identity, with strong views on abortion, and so on. So Russia, especially in the 90s and in the early 2000s, was seen as a, place where people could practice various forms of sexuality, where the rate of divorce was and still is very high. The rate of abortion is very high, and the people change their sexual partners quite a lot compared to other Western countries, let alone Eastern countries. So suddenly, my co-author and I were sensed around the year 2011, 2012, and these were the years when Putin made a decision on his return to power, September 2021. This was the famous decision, his announcement that he is coming back after Medvedev's interim presidency. That somehow the laws on regulating and initiatives on regulating human sexuality and human body suddenly became the center of politics. And it culminated in 2012 with the infamous so-called Zakon Podletsov, the law of the scoundrels, the Dima Yakovlev law, a law which abolished foreign adoption of Russian orphans. And in fact, it doomed many of the Russian children, especially children having these peculiarities of development, which were not at all adopted by Russian families, because Russian families take on a rather Darwinian perspective. They want a healthy child, the adopters. I mean, the Russian adopters, want a healthy child. So unhealthy children were mostly adopted by Americans. Somehow, strange people, like reaching out to the far cold Russia and paying something $50,000 to $70,000 to adopt a Russian child with Down syndrome. And Russia suddenly struck out against these Americans and other Westerners willing to adopt these children. A very strange move. Like, why? In retaliation to the Magnitsky affair, if you remember, there was the case of the lawyer Sergei Medvedev, who was tortured in prison, who died in prison, who investigated these murky schemes of the Russian authorities. And as a response to this, the US Congress announced, the US authorities actually announced a sanction list against Magnitsky. So Russia retaliated in hitting against the foreign adopters. So, and then it seemed quite odd. Why you use the children? Why use children? Why use especially, the orphans, and especially use the orphans with this some sort of deficits, health deficits, as a retaliatory matter. And then it became clear eventually through the years that the state sees the human body as a kind of resource, a nationalized resource, the bodies of the Russians, as some kind of a biological mass that it can use to punish the West, to lead the war, to discipline the society, to frighten the elite. So, and this is precisely what the kind of approach that Michel Foucault called biopower. And I would, take a few minutes of some, theory here, especially since this is a philosophical seminar on the history of philosophy. And really for our work, the figure of late Foucault was an inspiration, and especially his idea of biopolitics as part of biopower. Basically, early Foucault was treating on the state's power to kill and to torture. Like if you look at his classical work like Surveiller et Punir, Discipline and Punish, he talks about torture, right? He talks about how the state disciplines the human body in order to exert its sovereign power, to push the limits of sovereignty through various what he calls dispositives of control and various institutions of control over the human body. Be it the hospital, this medicinal gaze, be it the madhouse, the history of, he was writing the history of the madhouses, be it the institution of torture, the institution of execution, the guillotine, be it the institution of the school with the normalizing power over the pupils and with physical violence over the pupils. So Foucault was examining this, but later on he moved to more sophisticated means of power over the individual. And this was precisely the politics of health, the politics of sanitation, right? As we can see, for instance, with vaccination, with what like was Bruno Latour, another interesting figure writing on biopolitics, called the pasteurization of France, right? So the total policy of vaccination, which took on a very social dimension, distinguishing between the classes of the clean and the dirty citizens, right? So, and in this sense, Foucault means that biopolitics is the transfer from disciplining the individual body to disciplining the entire population by managing health, hygiene, nutrition, birth, sexuality. In a sense, the population is seen as a biological mass, not a social mass, but a biological mass, as a set of creatures possessing of specific biological and pathological characteristics that is managed by certain forms of knowledge and technology. So to take it further, like classical sovereignty is a subtraction mechanism. The state assumes the power to kill. It can take away your life. Biopolitics is the life-giving power. The state assumes the power to make you live, not to make an abortion, right? By abolishing abortion, by enforcing you to vaccinate, by enforcing you to go through medical tests. And later in the late capitalist society, you know, it enforces you to live a healthy lifestyle, to go through various, you know, medicinal procedures, go to fitness clubs, stay healthy, your employer. So this is also a local form of biopolitics. So this is from death management to life management. And anyway, in any position, it extends political modernity at placing life at the center of the political order. So as Foucault says, society's control over individuals was accomplished not only through consciousness or ideology, but also in the body and with the body. A follow-up to this.
The difference between death and life is illusory.
It's the management of life, and that's precisely what I will show in the towards the end. So you start from preserving life, but when you start this control over the human body, over the very fact of human life, you're very easily translating it into the control of human death. You see, the individual sovereignty is very much in the control of his or her body by an individual. And once you say, my body does not belong to me, my body belongs to the state, then the state can quite as easily take away your life. As in Russia, as we will, I will show later, as we show in the book, like with one hand, the state says, okay, we preserve the bodies of the Russians. We don't allow abortion. We support demography. We give mothers capital, maternity capital. We just build new apartments for the people. But then it turns out that this is all done so there's more new soldiers. So that women give birth to further soldiers, and then the state, by the same hand by which it was giving life, it grabs people's life and sends them to the trenches in Bakhmut. So these are just two sides of the same process. From that's what book is about, from biopolitics to necropolitics. So Giorgio Agamben, the Italian post-Foucauldian left thinker, was very much writing about biopolitics, and especially in that he came out with the idea of bare life. He was treating on the obscure figure of the Roman law called the homo sacer. And, you know, in ancient Rome, there were such people which were excluded from the social order. They were sort of not sentenced to death, but they became the homo sacer, a figure which anyone could kill. So that was an individual, a human body, which was exposed to death. It didn't possess of the characteristics of humanity, so to say. And Agamben transposed this and examined this on the example of the concentration camp. So these are the individuals whose life has zero value, right, in the concentration camp. They can die or live at any moment. And from there, he just took on his theory of bare life as the ultimate form of biopolitics, but also as the ultimate form of sovereignty, because these are people which are excluded from the legal order. And sovereignty, if we listen to Carl Schmitt as one of the theoreticians of sovereignty, is really the ability of the sovereign to stand above the law, to announce what he calls an Ausnahmezustand, a state of exception. So you accept people from the law, you accept people from the legal order, and therefore you prove your ultimate sovereignty. So Agamben established this connection between biopolitics and sovereignty, which is also very essential to understand Putin's project, the project of Putinism. So as I mentioned, in the years between 2012 and in the next 12 years until now, we have a strain of biopolitical manifestations, the state interventions in the realm of the human body. like juvenile justice, like the food sanctions against the West, burning Western products, like, large-scale state homophobia, anti-LGBT laws, anti-transgender laws, all forms of, sexual sovereignty of Russia. At the same time, Putin makes a big impact on demography. He has a dream of 500 million Russians. On many occasions, he has said, if it wasn't for the 20th century, if it wasn't for World War I, the revolution, for World War II, for whatever, for the collectivization, the atrocities of the Bolsheviks, Russia would have had 500 million people. He's really absolutely exalted about this whole idea of having 500 million Russians. So, and his demographic utopia is realized through various state measures on supporting the family, like preaching these traditional values, skrepy, bonds, and so on. Well, at the same time, they abolish and criminalize such phenomena as feminism, as LGBT, as the single. Sorry, can you please switch off the microphone if somebody's talking there? So as LGBT, as the child-free movement, child-free families or women. So they are almost you can get in prison in Russia these days for openly preaching feminism, let alone like homosexuality and LGBT things. You can get to prison for, like, I don't know, being a manager of a homosexual club. So, and in this sense, also Russia is very patriarchal and very male-centric order. It's in Russia, they've been sort of abolishing, there was a very toxic network and media platform, social network platform called Мужское государство, the male state, which was chasing women, which was, fighting abortion. Actually, it was so violent that it was even, its founder was even sent into exile. He was tried for extremism. But indeed, all of Russia itself is a мужское государство. Russia itself is a male state. It's a state which preaches values of masculinity. If you look at Putin himself, it is toxic masculinity. We see a toxic alpha male preaching typically male values. They send people to war using the male values. Ты что, не мужик? Are you not a man? You're not going to war? You're not going to fight? A real man only proves his masculinity, only proves his worth by going to war. That's the dictum in today's Russia. So let me show some slides here which illustrate this. I'll just skip some slides on the way. So here's this Dima Yakovlev law, the law on foreign adoption, the early stages, 2012. Which was made in a sort of a disciplinary mechanism. Already back then, many of the State Duma deputies were aware of what kind of a terrible law they are adopting, which basically sentences to death hundreds of Russian children. And indeed, already by now, over 200 children died because of this law, because they stayed in Russian care, which is not suited for, taking care of the kids with special needs. And they even, refused the adopters who have already had all the documents. They already paid tens of thousands of dollars for this, and they were still denied to take these children out of Russia. So in a sense, with this law, Russia used children as some kind of a liquid fuel, fossil fuel, as if the state has a tap on the pipeline. You can allow the export of oil, or you can ban the export of oil. You can allow the export of children, and you can ban the export of children. So it's treating people, like as a liquid biological mass. So this is one biopolitical law. The gay propaganda, here you see this infamous political leader Vitaly Milonov from St. Petersburg. He started as a really queer personality, very odd. For instance, in St. Petersburg, we were back laughing at it back then, 2010, 2011. There was, for instance, the law, закон о топоте котов и скрипе кроватей. There was the law on the stomping of the cats and the like squeaking of the beds, so that people should keep silence at night. It was the law of silence, so that neighbors were keeping silence and order after 11 p.m. so that, you know, the cats do not make noises, and that, you know, but it looks so funny. But then it moved on and on and on, and he's a champion of anti-LGBT crusade now. And so he is now one of the discourse makers, this Vitaly Milonov, together with another lady called Yelena Mizulina, a State Duma deputy. So these two, they offering this new biopolitical laws. This was joined in 2015 by the food sanctions. Another odd thing, Russia bans all Western foods as ideologically inappropriate, as toxic. And if any are discovered, they are destroyed. They are destroyed to the cameras. They have like what is called mobile crematoria. Mobile crematoria for destroying Western foods. So they travel around Russian cities. If they discover some frozen meats from the European Union, some peaches from whatever, some apples from Poland, the peaches from Greece. So there, and they invite the TV crews, they have the cameras, and they are like thrown by tons into this mobile stoves and in the crematoria. And they are like all this thing.
To interrupt, Mr. Medvedev, but we have a problem online. We still seeing the first slide instead of others. We can see.
You don't see the slides.
Yes.
I wonder, because I have the presentation.
Yes, but we can see only the first.
Can I? So this is the first slide. Yes, and so do you see the second now?
No.
Vous êtes en train de partager votre écran. Is this so?
Can you manage it in Zoom? Because we cannot see this in Zoom. Only the first one. Yes, that's better. Much more better.
Okay, so can you see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm moving through this Foucaultian slides.
Yes.
Okay.
Right now, yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry.
This is Agamben. Okay, thanks for telling. Okay, fine. Okay, so this is the biopolitical laws. So this is about the demography and reproduction, which I already said, all these posters calling Russians to have 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. The maternity capital, also the construction. So in this classical biopolitics, that's the addition mechanism, right? So also the new housing construction, because, you know, in the past 15 years, the Russian cities had huge housing projects. Well, most of them commercial, of course, but also there is a social housing by the state. And in advertising these housing projects, they very often use the metaphors of reproduction, of multiplication. So start a new family, have your new kids in the new apartment. So it's seen as some, you know, nests, as some anthills, this concrete anthills, as we call in Russia, человейники, human anthills. Не муравейники, муравейник is anthill, человейник is human anthill. So it's interesting how the state housing policy and the boom in the housing market have coincided with this biopolitical regulation by the state. And anti-abortion politics, of course, because Russia today is really is on the verge of criminalizing abortion. They're definitely forced out of the state insurance, medical insurance system. and all the gynecologists and all practitioners, they advise women against making an abortion. That's their main. But still, you know, and also in the smaller clinics, you can only make it in this major clinic, which for people living outside, so we're in the province, it's difficult to come and travel there. And actually, this policy of banning abortion, I think it's very nicely actually, let me go here, summarized in this poster, which I saw in the streets of Moscow some years ago, and it is so striking that I almost lost control of my car. I just stopped and photographed it. So you see, there is a fetus in the mother's womb, telling his mother, "Protect me today, and I will protect you tomorrow." And then some years down the road, he is born, he grows out into a small kid, and of course he becomes a soldier. He already wears a helmet, he wears the uniform, and then some years later he will take up the Kalashnikov gun and he will be. So it's just, and it says sign up for the prohibition of abortion in the nearest church. So it's interesting how this transition easily is made from preserving life to expending life as a soldier. You just need to give birth in order to have more soldiers, not just to have more humans, and not to increase the human capital, not to increase whatever life.
That's which year did you spot
No, it was quite a long time ago. I think like 10 years ago or something. It was
that? In relation to 2014, especially.
yeah, I think I'm thinking it was maybe 2014, 2015 that I spotted this, and I found it. It was also about at the same time. I can tell there was a funny video. It became viral, multfilm, like animated video on Russian, and it was about a lady, a girl. She's pregnant, and she's calling her boyfriend, and she says, "You know what? You know, like Petya, Vanya, I'm pregnant." And he says, "Well, have an abortion." He says, "What? Do you want me to have an abortion?" And he says, "Yes," and hangs up. And the girl is all in tears. And then there's like an icon on the wall. It's not an icon, but it's a portrait from this Besmertny Polk, Immortal Regiment. There's some medical nurse. There's a nurse from the Second World War. And suddenly this portrait, like especially in this Russian apocryphal genre of a talking icon, speaking icon, she starts speaking to the lady, to the girl, and says, "Don't make an abortion. You will bear a son, and he will protect you." And the girl says, "Yes, well, okay, I'll listen to you." And then eventually this animation movie goes on further, and some years down the road, the girl has a son. She takes the son by the hand, and they go attend the military parade. So it's the same as this. There's no father, actually. You know, in the Russian picture, in the big picture of things in Russia, there's no such thing as father. Women, like children, usually grow up in single-sex families. So there's mama and babushka. There's mother and grandmother that bring up the children. Like, because father usually disappears at the early stages. And then this, and in this movie, this happens as well. The father just, you know, is a voice in the telephone. He disappears, and then the girl gives birth to a kid, and of course the kid will become a soldier. So it's just as simple as that. Some other, you know, illustrations, of course, you know, the Russian nationalists and fascists had this idea of reproduction. Here we have Русский марш, the Russian march, ради будущего белых детей, for the future of white children. And of course, there is a white girl with, you know, dyed hair, with this flaxen white in the field of rye, like kissing this Aryan baby. And on the right one, you see also a white-haired Slavic guy in this sort of a Slavic shirt, not Ukrainian vyshyvanka, but more of a Russian kind. And he expels from the red square Jewish-looking cigarette, alcohol, and drugs. So as you see, they have distinct Jewish features. These three: this noses, curly hair, and so on. So you know, this nascent Russian fascism also had very biopolitical overtones. The idea of the sexual sovereignty of Russia, I think it's a very interesting concept offered by Alexander Baunov. He wrote about it that Russia has declared some kind of a sexual sovereignty, and that Russia is the custodian of the traditional family values against the moral decay of what we call in Russia, they call in Russia, gay Europa, not Europa, but gay Europa, the gay Europe. Gay Europe is the place of a moral decay, and it's funny. I mean, really, it sounded pretty marginal and obscure, but in the end, this is what Russia is fighting for in Ukraine in the war. And ask an average Russian, whatever fighter, so what is this war for? And he will reply, oh, well, so that there is no parent number one and parent number two. Like, we're making a war so that there is no gay marriage, because the Europe wants to just export gay marriage into Ukraine. And we do not want gay marriage, because this is like a demographic decay, this is social decay, this is moral decay. It's amazing how this biopolitical and sexual and gendered discourse has replaced, has been turned into, like, biopolitics has been transposed into geopolitics. Russia is making war for the sake of sex, for the sake of sexual practices. That's, as you see in this portrait, from biopolitics to geopolitics. Donbass, сердце России. Donbass is the heart of Russia. And that's actually a poster from the 1930s. The big coal exploration in the Donbass region. And here you see the heart and the blood vessels going to various Russian cities. But now it takes on a purely biopolitical tone, because we see the idea of Русский мир, of the Russian world, is the idea of blood. As the Germans would say, Blut und Erbe, blood and heritage, blood and soil. So they are talking of the Russian blood. And they are going there to Donbass to save the Russian blood. So it's a very bloody affair. It's a very fascist affair. Fascism is very biological. Fascism is about the body. Fascism is a very organic and nativist concept. And we see this nativism emerging over the past decade in discourses about Russia. And another interesting take on the return of the body in the center of Russian politics was the body of Putin. Because Putin's figure is also very biopolitical. From the early years on, he appeared as a, let's say, bodily manifestation of a new, healthy, and masculine Russia, especially against the backdrop of a weak, aging, ailing, and drinking Yeltsin. So suddenly comes, a fit man, a military guy, because, the way Putin came to power, they made these focus groups, they make social surveys, and all social surveys back in 1999 showed that, Russians want a military guy. Russian wants something decisive, someone decisive, something, speaking little, doing a lot, the man who can shoot, the man who has the inner knowledge of, who can apply violence, who can withstand violence, apply violence, like a true Russian muzhik. And Putin fit precisely this expected public image. So therefore, from the early ages, they were like displays of Putin's body, which I think was a very smart PR strategy. Riding horseback with his naked torso, going fishing, going whatever, all this outdoor exploits together with Shoigu somewhere in Siberian taiga, also merging this with the image of the Russian bear who also lives in the taiga. Putin referred often to Russia as a bear, like we as bear, we live in the taiga. And it worked. It worked for the Russian population because he became some sort of a ideal husband, a celestial husband for Russian women. But the core of the Russian electorate, of Putin's electoral, is a 40 plus, 50 plus single Russian woman, budgetnitsa, the budget worker, a school teacher, a railroad worker, a doctor. Like, this is the heartland. This is Putin's heartland. She is really, she lost her husband to alcohol, to whatever, to something years ago. She's alone. And then suddenly comes he, the ideal colonel, идеальный полковник, the one of which, the Russian women dream in all these songs and go all this, dances за тех, кому за 40, those over 40. They're just sitting there and waiting to be invited to a dance by some major, a colonel, someone in a uniform. And there he comes in a uniform. And they were like songs by Russian pop group блестящие. Хочу такого, как Putin. I want a man like Putin. There was a popular song there in the 1990s. And then the sociologists also like recorded there is like a record number of Russian women having sexual dreams about Putin back in the 1990s. And it worked not only in Russia. Look at the Putin imagery in the West. Like half of the caricatures will be seeing him with a naked torso, because he is seen as a quintessential man. He espouses his masculinity, right? Because against the background of so say rather immaculate Western political class, the faceless bureaucratic politicians of the West, suddenly comes up someone who can stand up. I remember somebody said, when Clinton came to power, someone commented, finally we have a president who we can imagine having sex with. So Putin is the kind of a this kind of person. So and finally Putin's body became the biological manifestation of a Russian political body. And we are suddenly moving back to the medieval political theology. There's a wonderful book by Ernst Kantorovich, the study of the medieval political theology, called The Two Bodies of the King. It's like there is a political body of the king, like the king in parliament, the king in the palace. And there's a physical body of the king. And the physical body of the king becomes the manifestation of the political body of the nation, right? So therefore, in a way, the king does not possess of his or her own body. I mean, his body is the product of, national political imagination. I was impressed. I remember in my first visit to Versailles, as I was visiting the king's chambers. It was interesting that every physical act of the king was a matter of public life. Like the king, for instance, when he had morning toilet, when he was sitting on the pot in the morning, he was taking reports. So, the people watched the king defecate, and they were reporting to him while he was sitting there and defecating. And there was especially a special public, it's still there in Versailles, there is a special public display of the king, of the queen giving birth. So when the queen is giving birth to the heir, there are stands. It's like a theater. So the people can sit there in the stands and watch for the queen giving birth, because it's a matter of national politics. Giving a birth, having a healthy birth to the heir of the throne. So in this, and also, but this is also by extension the result of why you have to execute a king, right? Because in order to change the political order, you have to behead a king, because the king is the only bearer of the ancien regime. So in the sense, Putin's body became like in the Middle Ages, like in the early stages of modernity, like in this pre-Republican period, in the high absolutism, his body became the investiture of the political body of the nation. The national politics is invested in his body. And indeed, Putin's health is the matter of national concern. When Putin disappears from public scene in Russia, life freezes. There's absolutely, like, the life is put on a pause. There's no political life. There's no comment. There's no Duma meetings. Everyone is sitting there and just wondering what happened to Putin, what happened to his health, what happened to his life. So it's interesting how his body is also part of biopolitics. A large move towards this was made in the COVID epidemic. It did two things to the Russian political and social environment. First, it medicalized life, and second, normalized death. Suddenly, Russians learned that they are mortal, and like all of us, and they're like suddenly mortal, as in Bulgakov's book, Человек не только смертен, но внезапно смертен. The man is not only mortal, but suddenly he is mortal. But also it taught the authorities an instructive lesson that Russians basically do not care much about death and about dying. In that country, there's a very fatalist approach to death, as summarized in a famous motto, which ruled back then in 2020 during COVID pandemic, and now in 2024, 22, 23, 24 during war. Кому суждено умереть, умрет. Those who are destined to die will die. It's very Russian. It's the kind of a fatalism that displays total disregard for your health, for your safety, for your security, for your habits, for your planning. Look, it's a country where at least half the population does not buckle up in a car. People do not wear seatbelts in Russia. People have sometimes they have special stubs which are inserted in this lock in a seatbelt so that it doesn't make a sound. The car wouldn't, would be ringing a bell if you haven't fastened the seatbelt. So people would rather, or people like sit upon the seatbelt. They have the seatbelt behind their backs and then buckled up. So, and indeed, for instance, if you drive a Russian taxi, well, maybe not now, but until recently, a taxi driver could be seriously insulted if you fasten your seatbelt in a car. Don't you trust me? Don't you trust my driving skills? Why do you have and that's the thing that tells you about Russia's approach to life. And precisely because this is a country where basically, I have to say, this is ages, centuries of slavery that taught Russians this disregard of life, because your life can be easily taken away by the state, by war, by insecurity, the general insecurity of your own life. So people have not learned to cherish life. And in all classes of society, not just the so-called common people, the elite too. Yuri Lotman was writing this in his study of the Russian dvoryanstvo, of the Russian nobility of the 18th and 19th century. And he asks a question, why so many people just shoot in duels? Why so many people are engaged in the game of cards? Look at all of Russian literature. It's about duels and cards and duels. And Russian writers just lose their entire fortunes by card playing. The same Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, I mean, they all played cards. They all lost a fortune to the cards. And he says that's because also the Russian nobility did not possess of their own life. So they lived in the realm of risk. They played with risk. They played with life. So therefore, the game of cards and the game of duels, or the habit of duels, is this manifestation of the low value of human life in Russia. But now this has been once again exposed through COVID, and then once again it's exposed in this war. Another biological manifestation was the poisonings, the high-profile poisonings by Putin's thugs, by the Russian special services, to name just a few, like the poisoning of Litvinenko, the poisoning of Skripals, the poisoning of Navalny, the poisoning of some other leaders of opposition, Alexei Karamurza, Dmitry Bykov, to name just a few. So there is another, approach to human body, which is what is this, like redémarrage nécessaire? Do I have to do something here? 2 heures. No? It's actually here in the computer. Plus tard. Okay, good. The poisoning epidemic. And finally, in all this sort of preparatory things for war, I can quote the necropolitics of repression. And this is, the revelations of the large-scale use of violence and torture in Russian prison, in the police precincts, in the labor camps. This was quite evident already for decades, but now with this mobile phone revolution and social networks, that suddenly everything became online. And there was like gigabytes of online evidence of large-scale use of torture in the Russian prison. So, and this also added another dimension to this, body-centric politics in Russia. So once again, we found ourselves in a situation where the centerpiece of politics is the human body. That the way the state tries to manipulate human body, to manipulate sexuality, to promote birth, to promote correct sexual practices, normalize sexuality. And on the other hand, the same state is beating the individuals and torturing and raping the individuals, as we have seen in these videos. Then finally we make this transfer. As I said, with one hand, the state gives life, but with the other hand, the same state, the same Leviathan can take life. And we make a transfer from biopolitics to necropolitics. And here I would quote from Foucault, I would quote Achille Mbembe. He has this book of Politique de l'intimité, with the idea of necropolitics, the subjugation of life to the power of death, creation of the death worlds. And we see in today's Russia how this politics of obsessive care by the state have been superseded by the politics of death, the cult of death. And this already emerged during COVID. This emerged during Putin's speeches. How often he said, okay, we're ready to use nuclear weapons because we are like sacred Russians. We will go to heaven and they will die. So he's like speaking like some Ayatollah. So the Western counterparts will just die as sinners, and we as Russians, we will go to paradise. And then it eventually, this necropolitics broke out into the open in Russia's war in Ukraine. And this will be like the last part of my presentation, this translation from Biopolitics or Necropolitics. And there's several dimensions to this necropolitics. First, of course, is the large-scale politics of genocide. And I have no reservations on using this word, as I have no reservations about using the use of word fascism with respect to Putin's regime. And if you look at the data from Mariupol, at the large-scale torture and extermination in Bucha, Irpin, Gostomel, this names ring a bell. So it's the same like, the villages burned by the Germans in the Second World War, and the names of the concentration camps. There's a large-scale torture. There's a large-scale extermination of Ukrainians by the national principle, and in this torture camps, they look out for teachers of Ukrainian language, they look out for bearers of Ukrainian identity, they look for tattoos, those who have the trezub, this trident, the symbol of Ukraine, they are executed and tortured as Banderovites, as Nazi, as Ukrainian Nazi, let alone the large-scale rape and abduction of Ukrainian children. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of children that have been stolen by Russia and that have been forcefully sent into Russia. That's actually the only article for which the Russian fascists are tried by the Hague Tribunal. In the Hague, what they're giving them is the abduction of Ukrainian children. So the numbers are really unknown, but we are talking in the order of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of children that have been forcefully moved to Russia. So this is purely German practice. This, how it is called in Germany, just remind me this, Lebensborn. That's the Nazi program of Lebensborn, when they took Czechs, Slovak, whatever kids, and took them away from their families and placed them in German families, and forcefully Germanizing them. So by the same token, they're taking away Ukrainian kids and forcefully Russifying them. The necropolitics of mobilization, in which this population is seen as disposable resource. state reaches out for the available population. It's really like oil. You reach out for the more disposable resources, what's easier to extract. It's easier to extract people from Siberia, from the factory monotowns, from East Siberia, from Buryatia, from the Far East. Sometimes they just empty the entire villages. There are certain villages in Siberia where all men have been mobilized to war. Like there were 65 men, all 65 men from the village were taken to war, leaving only, it's like during Second World War. They're only like women and eventually widows leaving behind there. Because it's much harder to get a Muscovite. Muscovites are sleazy and evasive, and they can bribe their way out, and they have resources. They can run away via Georgia and Kazakhstan and so on. So why go for the Muscovite when you can go for some guys in Irkutsk Oblast? And they go for like university auditoria, they go for football matches, they look for migrants at metro stations, at railway stations. So they're like going with the nets. They're like just getting people in the net and sending them off to the front. A wonderful case of necropolitics, biopolitics, so necropolitics is Wagner. That's amazing. I mean, I think this story has yet to be written and understood, and it waits like new Agambens and Foucault's, the idea of like tens of thousands of people whose life was simply like zero value. It was expanded. Like to begin with, people in Russian prison live such a pitiful life, a life of torture, of daily torture. They would happily sign up to be sent to the deadly front lines in Ukraine where stand a 50% chance of getting killed. They would rather do that than stand in the Russian prison. But also, once again, once they're sent there to the front lines, they endured a tremendous amount of loss. They really used as cannon fodder. They were sent to the front lines. They were behind them. They were the infamous Zagrad Otriady. They were like guard squads, shooting squads, usually made of Chechens. Would shoot them in the back. If they wanted. So these people had no option of giving up of surrendering to Ukrainians. They had because for any white flag they were shot by the fellows. They had no option of getting wounded because they just left the wounded to die in the fields or to crawl themselves back to the homelines and so on. So it's an amazing story of expanding human flesh, the whole Wagner story. So, and it's amazingly the same bare life of which Agamben was writing in the concentration camp. And generally, I just wanted to end with this image of this wonderful woman who summarized Putin's biopolitics. And this was a video. I mean, if I should have inserted a video here, but it can be easily Googled. It was last year, and this was a drunk Russian lady in TikTok, sitting in a kitchen with a glass of something, maybe vodka, maybe whatever, a liquor. And she was addressing to Ukrainian women, Ukrainian mothers, saying, you Ukrainian mothers will never understand us Russian mothers. Like, look at me, she says. I have 4 sons, and I will easily expend 4 of them. I will have all 4 of them sent to the front and killed for the sake of Russia, because I will give birth to new ones. And she had like some substantial bosom. And then she showed this and says, вот такие мы русские матеря. So that's the way we are, Russian mothers. So then she drank this glass. So that's precisely what Marshal Zhukov told in his apocryphal meeting with there was a meeting in apocryphal, but according to Eisenhower, he asked Zhukov, why did you have to waste like 300,000 Russian lives to take Berlin when it could have been done on this Yale of Heights, when it could have been done by much smaller, like smarter tactical moves? And Zhukov said, never mind, бабы новых нарожают. The women will give birth to new ones. And that's precisely, you have this Baba. You have this lady who says, yes, I'm ready. I will give birth to new ones. So send mine to the front. And that's really where the biopolitics of the state meets the same sort of biopolitical and the necrophilic instincts of the population. So summing this all up, I think this really all adds up to the biological matrix of true fascism. Because fascism, as I already mentioned, is very organic. The emergence of organic contour in politics in the early 20th century, like coming from racism by Gobineau, this theory is coming from also organic nativist geopolitical theories by Haushofer and Chelen, attaching people to land, talking of the virtue of land, of the virtue of blood, right? Like the offsprings of late romanticism of the 19th century. So fascism was born as a very biological concept. And Russian fascism is of the same kind. Because as I mentioned, in this past 10, 12 years, we suddenly see the human body as the centerpiece of Russian politics. And it is really about extending the limits of sovereignty. They're now no longer just territorial. As Putin says, границы России не кончаются нигде. Borders of Russia end anywhere, do not end anywhere. They end nowhere, right? They're everywhere in the world, this would be borders of Russia. But also the borders of Russia are inside the human body. They're inside our bedrooms. They're inside the refrigerators. They're inside the kitchens. So the state extends its limits of sovereignty into what was supposed to be a purely private human domain. And in this sense, Putin is rewriting the Russian political community on a biological basis, not just a territorial, but on a biological basis. It's re-territorializing politics on a biopolitical foundation. And another important conclusion from here is that the body is seen as a resource. You see, Russia as such is about resources. Simon Kordonsky, the wonderful Russian sociologist, was writing about this, ресурсное государство, a resource state. That's what he's talking about. You see, in Russia, everything is turned into a resource. And resources is not just oil and gas and copper and platinum and whatever, and coal. A resource is a distributable, disbursable good which can be managed and distributed by the state. Fear is a resource. Knowledge is a resource. Population is a resource in the hands of the state. And in this sense, the human body is also seen as a resource which the state can freely administer as it administers oil. Therefore, there's a famous Russian phrase, люди — это новая нефть. People are the new oil, right? And we see it physically how it is done. Remember how I started by saying about this Dima Yakovlev law? Like small kids are the new oil. You can either export and you can abandon an export of kids to the West, of the children's bodies to the West. And, you know, prisoners in labor camps are the new oil. You can just use them, burn them in the furnace of war in Ukraine, put them into a meat grinder. You know, just as a funny joke, as an anecdote, the governors in like Siberian provinces already are saying, I mean, that's too bad, we're facing unemployment because the labor camps are emptied and they have to fire the prison guards. And they're like the entire generations of people living by the prison, and they have the entire families working in the prison industry as guards, whatever. But now the prisons have been emptied. We don't know how many people were killed. At least 50,000 people of a prison population were killed there. But maybe, you know, we never know. They're still continued. They're now recruited not by Prigozhin's ЧВК Wagner, but there's another private military company called Storm Z by the Ministry of Defense. So they are continuing like putting the prisoners into this meat grinder. So it's interesting that, you know, there's unemployment, and it's a concern for the regional governors that they're new unemployed because there are too many prisoners killed in war. So finally, yes, I would say that everything that I've talked about is really a sign of a emergence of a fascist regime in Russia, on where I think I have no reservations at calling it a fascist, but also with clear consequences for the world, with clear moral consequences and also strategic and geopolitical obligations for the outside world, because this kind of fascism should be given the same treatment as the German fascism of 1945. Whether we like it or not, it's a continuation of World War II. The fact is that World War II has not been really finished. You know, 80 years ago, the free world was facing two evil dictatorships, one fascist, another Bolshevik, another Stalinist. And the West, for its own survival, made a very unnatural alliance with one of these two dictatorships and prevailed. But, you know, one fascism is gone and another state. And it survived. It resurrected after Stalin, and then suffered a temporary retraction in 1991. But then it, once again, it's resurrected under Putin. So it's the same fascist evil that was threatening Europe back in the 1930s. So I would say that, you know, the West faces the same task of dealing with that kind of fascism as it dealt with the German fascism in 1945. And without that, there will be no peace in Europe, no security, and no future for the generations to come. So with this solemn dictum, let me end my remarks, and then yeah, I'd be happy to listen to your questions, critiques, and comments. Thank you. It is.
This kind of fascism is not ideological.
No.
There is not the idea.
It's a different, yeah, that's a good question. Yes, what was this your the question in your comment? Yes, you're right, and I can explain that. It's a different word. It's not the fascism of the 1930s. It's not the fascism of, you know, Leni Riefenstahl movies. It was the torch processions with huge ideologization, with the fire in the eyes. No, it's a postmodern fascism. A fascism rather of an entertainment kind, a fascism which is born out of computer networks and like fighting a war by proxy, that the war is done by some brave warriors. But nevertheless, I would say that even without the mass mobilization, the society can be fascist by using a fascist discourse and by the treatment of the other and by installing the cult of death, the cult of memory, the cult of the ancestors, destroying, you know, for the sake of the past, destroying for the sake of memory. So in many, if you look at this classical definitions of fascism, like take one by Umberto Eco, for instance, Russia fulfills most of criteria. So I would say that you can be fascist without mass mobilization. But even that in Russia is more or less the mass mobilization. It's not mobilization, but there is mass acceptance of war. There's mass acceptance of this regime. People cannot think outside of the state. They do not think outside of the framework of the war. They don't have a different optic. That's a perennial Russian problem, that people cannot take their brain away from the state. They cannot take their eyes away from the state. So if the state decides that Ukrainians are natives, then we have to believe it. We have to take it. If the state decides that there has to be a war in Ukraine, a war in the world, then we have to take it. So in my opinion, this is a new kind of fascism, but a fascism nevertheless.
What is your interpretation of this military cathedral in Moscow?
It's a joke. I mean, once again, it calls for some profound semiotic interpretation. Well, it's basically it's a pagan temple of war. It has very little to do with Christianity. It's really a cult of war, a cult of victory. And I've had some read some interesting reviews by students of iconography, students of orthodoxy, students of architecture, exploring the iconographic program of this temple, and it's amazing. I mean, they have figures of in the first design, then they moved them. They had figures of Stalin and Putin and Valentina Matvienko there. And instead of the angels, they have the partisani, the guerrillas. They have this matrosi. They have the sailors. So they're all, instead of these nебесные силы, the celestial forces, they're coming on top. And basically, I mean, you won't believe it. I mean, it, for instance, as the relics, it has Hitler's hat. So as a relic, it has Hitler's uniform there in the sanctuary. Its steps are made. From the trophy German weaponry. It has metal steps there, and they've took some German tanks from the military museum, Музей вооруженных сил, and they've melted it into the metal steps. So it's, and then it has some numerical symbols built into it. Like there's like the diameter of the cupola is 19 meters, 45 centimeters, saying this is 1945. And the height of it is something, it is the same as the number of the days of war, and like the number of, I don't remember, the number of mosaics is the number of the heroes of the Soviet Union. So they're like 100 numerical things. So it's absolutely absurd, this whole temple. So yeah, they would say it's a temple of war, it's a temple of death, and it's really the abuse of traditional Russian Christianity. And it just shows the subservient role played by the Russian Orthodox Church in this general discourse in war and in Putinism.
I'm sorry for interrupting you, but sorry, can you hear me right now from Zoom? Sorry for interrupting you, but I have two, not questions, but things to say. First of all, may you please stop the presentation so we can see you better right now? And second, may those who are about to make questions right now come closer to the microphone because we cannot hear them.
Right. What I can do is I can translate the questions for the audience so that it could be. Yeah, so it's not possible that people just come here and so we don't have the microphone. Let me.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think I close this one. Okay, right. So I close the screen, right? So you don't see it. Okay, so I will. I can also let me take some questions from the audience, and then I will take some questions from the chat. So you can put the questions to chat. Okay. Yes, the gentleman over there had a question.
What we are talking about is it special to Russian country, or there is a danger that something like that will be expanded to Western?
No, yeah, I wouldn't like to talk about Russia's exclusivity. It's, fascism, after all, is not a Russian invention, right? And actually, it was through many nations in the early 20th century.
After COVID times, can we expect something like that?
In Russia, there are no limits. I mean, basically, there is a threat, of course, of nativist organic politics. Like Putinism as such can be seen in a broader global perspective. Putinism has resemblances to Trumpism, to the extreme right in Europe, to whatever you have Le Pen and Salvini, and the new Slovak government, Fico and Pellegrini, and whatever, to many, to Brexit. Everywhere in the world, there is, in the 21st century, there's a reaction to globalization. by developing some kind of a protectionist, nativist, conservative ideologies that stress the nation, that want to put limits on the human body, that deny this new left ideologies of like tolerance, acceptance, migration, the new ethics, feminism, and so on. So yes, Putinism is one of. The problem with Russia that it has no limits on state power. It has no society. It has no independent politics. So if the state is taken over by a certain ideology, then it just goes to the limit, as happened with Bolshevism, right? You know, the left idea has its merits, and, you know, it was transformed in the 20th century into some very healthy projects like social democracy, like, you know, some European projects, and, you know, social state, and, you know, in Sweden and whatever. But in Russia, it was just taken to the extreme because nobody could limit the Bolsheviks. So it turned into a gulag. It turned into a gulag. The left idea. So the same organic nativist politics of today are turning into extreme forms of Putinism and fascism and war, and now threatening the whole world. Russia can destroy the world so that there is no gay marriage. Basically, let's put it this way. So it's like Iran in a way, but Iran is still largely guarded and observed, and, you know, its missiles can be intercepted, as we have seen recently in Israel. But who is there? Who is out there who can intercept all of Putin's missiles? So that's the problem. Okay, this question, and then there's one in the back.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I have two quick questions. The first one is about what you said about the leader of Muzhskoye Gospodarstvo. You said he was sued for extremism.
Поздняков, his name is Vyacheslav Pozdnyakov.
So how do you explain this definition of extremism for the regime? Where is this definition of radicality and extremism come from, if, you know, if he is advocating some of the ideas that the regime wants to promote?
I have to double check his case. What I know is he is probably in Serbia now, or in one of the Balkan states. And I have to double check what he was charged with. I think it was extremism. The point is, you know, extremist in Russia is anything that is threatening to the state. So they don't make a distinction. They could be an extremist as a feminist. They can be an extremist, for instance, as now Zhenya Berkovich and Petrichuk, the theater director and the playwright, are tried for like justifying terrorism, extremism by simply writing a play about the women. Did you follow the case? It's one of the really amazing cases. Like some years ago, they made a very famous theatrical play. Yes, Finis Yasny Sokol, and doesn't matter what it's called in Russian, about the monologues of the girls who married the Islamists who traveled to the Islamic State. So there are ladies who just really fall in love with these ladies and with these guys, and they left behind. These are monologues. So it's basically like very much anti-extremist, anti-radicalism, and whatever. So now comes 2023, and these two women who also, especially Berkovich, have a strong anti-war position, are suddenly singled out by the authorities, tried for this, and now they've been in prison for a year, and now they're facing heavy prison sentences of maybe up to 20 years for like preaching terrorism and extremism. So this is just one example of this. So extremism is absolutely an all-encompassing article of the law, which has been invented to punish, to stigmatize, criminalize, and punish any non-state activity, any non-state statement. So within Kuznikov's case, I think it became really dangerous in a sense that he had tens of thousands of followers, this male state, мужское государство, and they started really to perpetrate acts of violence in the streets. So they were curtailed by the authorities. And, the point is, I have to understand that the authorities, this repressive apparatus, does not really have an ideological program. They're like predators. Wolves in the forest do not have an ideological program. They go after anyone that moves, anyone that's, left behind. So they are just predators. They're following their predatory logic. And therefore, I wouldn't see any ideological, complex ideological considerations. This is a male state, but we're somehow trying the male state. They don't care. Anyone that's not a cop themselves, they are just tried for whatever, extremism, terrorism, fakes against the Russian army, being under the foreign influence, whatever. There are many new articles which can be invented to just take people off the streets. Yes.
And I just wanted to make a small comment about this Russian extremism. I think for Russian government it's also important to exclude any force of organization. Like this мужское государство, I think, was the form of organization. The same with Russian nationalists, So everything that is not sanctioned by government has to be destroyed.
Exactly. Any non-governmental form of organization is a threat, even if you're like organizing in support of Putin. So even then, if it's not sanctioned by the state, you're a threat. There was a question from the lady back there. Okay.
Thank you very much for your very clear presentation. My question is, what is the opposite of biopolitics for you? I know you already said that it's democratic societies, feminism, so it's very easy to understand how it can go in the extreme, but how it's possible to go from biopolitics to
Well, no, I mean, it's simple. Well, biopolitics is a form of oppressive politics. So basically, the basic human rights. The human rights entail the rights of a person on his or her body, to dispose of the body, to, for instance, commit suicide, to use light drugs, whatever, all these things that liberal societies have more or less allowed and institutionalized, because sort of a I wouldn't even say permissive, but non-interventionist state policy on the body, which is part of any normal liberal polity. So, and I think the Western society has moved towards this over centuries, and even, progressive liberal polities have very late adopted like gay rights, like Britain in the 1950s and 60s was still largely anti-gay, or whatever, abortion rights. We still have many developed liberal polities that are against abortion, and so on. So I think it's sort of an evolutionary process, which generally goes in this direction. But of course, they're like significant, like coming like this reactive waves.
Very short question. Do you see any connection between the term you're talking about and the discussion for life, for choice in American society?
Oh, yes, absolutely. A very big connection. Actually, the American neocons are very much behind Putin. And Pat Buchanan had a famous article saying Putin is one of us. And actually, Russia, they solicited a huge financial support from this American neocon congregations, and it's easy. Like even the recent interview by Tucker Carlson, traveling to Putin and having this complimentary interview and questioning him on matters of his listening to his lectures on history. So yes, as I mentioned, Putinism is just one extreme form of the general conservative turn in global politics. of the past of this post 9/11 world. So, and therefore it's dangerous on its own merits, but it's also part of a general. You see, in this sense, I see a symmetry between 21st and 20th century. It was the same thing in the 20th century, because the world at the late of the 19th century, early 20th centuries reached a very high level of globalization. Actually, by some accounts, globalization was even bigger back then. The amount of foreign investment versus national GDP was higher 100 years ago, 120 years ago than it is now. And as a reaction to this, we had these conservative and fascist projects. The entire first third of the 20th century was about the comeback of the human body, the nation, nativism, organicism, fascism. So the Second World War was fought about this. And in the 21st century, I think the history largely repeats itself. The unprecedented levels of globalization in the 1990s, as summarized by the end of history theory, aided by the internet, the information superhighway, politics by, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, the democratic wave, the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, gates opening, societies moving. And then comes the breaking point, the 9/11. And then there's a huge anti-democratic, anti-globalization wave, which is carried by a number of polities. As I mentioned, also the United States and Britain was Brexit, and many healthier European societies are doing this. So, yeah, in this sense, there is a rhyme between Putinism and Trumpism and American neoconservatism.
I'm sorry, I have a continuation to my previous question. I noticed being in the States that there were a quite remarkable correlation between the pro-life people and the leftists. Does the same exist in Russia? Can you notice any correlation between leftists, which are quite numerous in Russia?
Flat Earth.
Flat Earth. Yeah. Flat Earth.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think there's a social correlation. There's like these people, of course, they're aided by social networks. In Russia, there's a famous pop singer Yuri Loza, who really like preaches this. He goes like broad on TV. He is also a Putin fan. No, I look. I would say that it's the time for all sort of conspiracy theories. It was very evident in the COVID time when there were like COVID dissidents, COVID deniers, the vaccine dissidents, anti-vaxxers, and so on. So they really flourished, all these theories during the time of COVID, during the time of crisis. So all this conspiratorial mentality, of course, it is a nourishing ground for ideas of Putinism, because Putin comes from the same background. He is coming from the school of KGB. They are taught conspiracies there. They are taught that, the world is made of conspiracies, the conspiracy by Rothschilds and the world Jewish conspiracy, the Western conspiracy against Russia, the global capital here and there. So they grow up with this thinking. And then, of course, there's, the common Russian, so to say, to whom Putin caters with his message. They also grow up in the idea that all the world is ruled by everyone is a marionette of somebody else. And that in Ukraine is a global conspiracy against Russia, and the war in the Middle East is the global conspiracy by Americans, and so on. So yes, I mean, these things, they very much flow into each other. The flat earth, the COVID deniers, the global Jewish plot, and Americans plotting to split up Mother Russia. Alexei Yablokov, if you're interested, there's a Russian researcher who's written a couple of interesting books about this. Let me go to some. Yeah, there are some questions. Let me give floor to the advanced the shared slides. Next slide, indeed. Yes, thank you. No, actually, there are no. There's just thanks and please move the slides thing. So yeah, we have time. So if anyone is interested on the internet, please write your messages to chat. Yes, there's a lady back there.
I think it's generally considered, certainly in our countries here, that one of the reasons that we won the Second World War, the Allies, was precisely because of this artificial life on the Soviet side. 26 million, 27 million Soviet dead. So this is essentially these biopolitics of fascism, which is a continuation of the grand tradition, which is today extremely frightening for democratic societies because we don't fight like that. Now, this propaganda is essentially creating fear internationally. So, in a way, by explaining his state ideology in this way, it's almost serving him. It's almost serving the Russian aggrandizement in international competition. We are the country who is not afraid to fight.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Russians are not afraid to die. Like all propagandists. It is said it's a jihadist ideology. Therefore, you have no remedy against a jihadist of somebody who's willing to sacrifice his or her life. You know, when you walk into the crowd, just all with explosives on your chest. So Russians, in a sense, and I've been writing about this already for a decade. Writing about that there's a jihad in Donetsk. Like Russians, in a sense, are like jihadists. From the other side, of course, it's not ideological, it's not so motivated, it's not religious, it's anti-religious, of course, because Orthodox religion prohibits suicide. But in essence, in sending the message out to the world, it's exactly like this. We're the ones who are, passionate enough, to sacrifice our lives for some cause, no matter which one. And that's what the liberal decaying West cannot oppose because they cherish human life and that's their weakness. So yes, unfortunately, this is the message, and therefore, so biopolitics here comes handy. Well, in this case, I wouldn't talk about exactly biopolitics, but rather biopower. Because still biopolitics, if we go back to Foucault, is more about preserving life and managing life and, this health habits, hygienic habits, and so on. That's what biopolitics is about. But this is pure biopower. Yes.
Yeah, I have another question about the figure of Vladimir Putin as a perfect body or like the embodiment of something that's representative of what he's trying to promote. How do you explain that he hasn't been able to promote the other aspect, more traditional, promoting himself, representing himself as traditional family values with high number of children, a wife, and an Orthodox wedding or whatever? How come this is missing in the picture?
That's a good question, and it's really funny because by way of nostalgia, so to say, and regret and tragedy, the classical Christian politician, much like any American president, would be Alexei Navalny. That's the man who had an ideal family life, who had an ideal wife with children, all public, all exposed, and who also at the end of his life, came to Christianity. Look at his last speeches, his last letters. He was always comparing himself to the figure of Christ. And in fact, his self-sacrifice is profoundly Christian, what he did. So that's interesting that although it was Putin and the Russian elite who is preaching all this skrepy and bonds, I mean, it is precisely them who are leading the most corrupt and absolutely pervert life. Putin with the unknown number of wives. We don't know who is Putin's wives. There are like widespread rumors about the orgies that are surround Putin, of, you know, buses of women catered to the, of him supporting, you know, the likes of Berlusconi, the likes of, you know, the Italian, I forgot what's his name, not Italian, sorry, Israeli president, who was sentenced for 9 rapes. So he raped 9 women. And then Putin made a public comment, you know, congratulations to the Israeli president, such a strong man, we all here envy him. Мы здесь все ему завидуем. He makes a public comment to the crowd, especially on learning the news that he has got a prison sentence. So, and that's exactly, and then, you know, we'll look at his palaces that's shown by Navalny, all this, you know, aqua discoteca, all this, you know, boudoirs that he has there in his palace in Gelendzhik. Then look at the entire Russian elite. It's like one pervert on another pervert on not just pervert. I'm not against perversion, but it's really the people that have absolutely murky sexual lives, that have second, third families, that have you know, several wives, that have engaged in these orgies in the saunas. There's, you know, there are revelations about all these Duma deputies. Like take the one, for instance, who replaced Zhirinovsky, Slutsky, now the head of the Liberal Democratic Party. It's terrible. He has like you know, a dozen cases against him by famous female journalists, all of whom who harassed, and there's evidence of rape and harassment and everything. And he just prides in this. He is, you know, a male in his prime, like Trump. It's amazing. So this just shows you the extent of hypocrisy that is characteristic of the Russian elite. It just goes for the proles, all this, you know, family values. I mean, this, you're cannon fodder, therefore you should multiply. You should, you know, give birth to more soldiers to be sent to the trenches in Avdiivka. And for us, for the elite, there's a famous Russian word, потому что может, because we can. So they show because we can, therefore because I can. I have as many wives as I wish. I have, you know, I dump as many children as I wish, and I live the kind of a promiscuous life as much as I wish. Because in Russia, what's much more important than this family values is the symbolic policy, the symbolic displays of power, driving a car in a symbolic way, behaving in a symbolic way, having the entourage of security behind you, like having as many families as you like. This is really a part of the daily life of the Russian elite, because they have permanently to prove their higher status. It's the policy of symbol. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Them to invite in your research group specialist in psychiatry. Yeah.
Oh yes, that would be a good idea for anything happening in Russia. Or rather, in psychiatry, well, yes, Putin is really is a combination of a psychiatric diagnosis. Actually, I made some interviews about this. Basically, psychiatrists, they refrain from doing this because I think there's a Goldwater rule. Barry Goldwater was prohibited from running for US election because some psychiatrists, you know, made a diagnosis of him without direct interview. So since then, basically in journalism, there's the Goldwater rule. But despite this, you know, people really say about the number of complexes that throw Putin. And there's obviously some childhood traumas, humiliations, being, you know, the underdog, being the small guy in the yard, and then, you know, he takes up to judo school, and then he takes up to KGB school as a way of revenge for the earlier humiliations, and he, you know, takes this further. It's a revenge for imagined Russia's suffering in the hands of the West. What he's doing now. So yes, there's all set of diagnoses, and even more than that, I think we need some specialist in absurdity and the literature of absurd, because what's happening now is really, it's like it's been written by some, Jean Genet, Samuel Beckett, like Quentin Tarantino, this kind of things, which is like the daily Russian this news feed. It's astonishing. It's an absurdity. They're like daily. I have a diet of two astonishment. First, the news of the other civil victims in Ukrainian scale, and the second, the news of absurdity of what's happening in Russia. I didn't know I would just fall into all this trash that's happening between my some bloody guignol, as this French theater genre which we have. It's just unbelievable that I really can't believe. I still have not lost my capacity for surprise as I read the daily news from Russia. Just about the same biopolitics. I'll just maybe driving to a close, just to give you a couple of examples on biopolitics, how it informs daily Russian life. News one, and we're just talking with Yulia before this, volleyball, a jolly game of volleyball, and there are two like Russian championships. There are two teams, Dynamo and Lokomotiv. Lokomotiv happens to win. But then Dynamo files a protest for LGBT propaganda, because these female players, after a winning ball, they were like hugging and kissing each other. And so it's now like they're looking at it in the Russian Volleyball Federation, because they're saying that maybe it was LGBT propaganda that the girls hugged and kissed each other. Especially, they stress that some of them kissed themselves on the lips. It's in the news. It's all over in the news every day. It's like 2 days before, 2 days ago. The other piece of news is poetry. Yes, there's a poetic prize named after Andrei Dementiev. There was like a late Soviet poet. So they have a poetry prize from him. And it's been around for some years, but now this year they made a notable rule to the conditions of the competition, that the applicant for the prize should not have changed his or her gender. So when applying for the prize, you should submit 2 documents. First, your birth certificate, saying, for instance, that you were male at birth. And then you have to show your proof of gender from today, saying that you are still a man, that you haven't changed your gender. So there's getting on this bandwagon of, abolishing transgender, which is a big thing in Russia these days. Somehow, like all Duma, all newspapers are very just set ablaze by the transgender issues. Like they're looking around, what if there are transgenders on the street? What if there are transgenders in this audience? Will be like, I don't know, somehow infected by them. So we'll become transgender ourselves if there's a transgender person walking next to you. So it's like this, just 2 pieces of news from like, it was yesterday or the day before yesterday on the internet. It's amazing, like the whole country, like I used to think of my former country as some sort of a civilized enterprise with, educated people, like driving cars, using telephones and whatever, preaching some kind of normalcy, having some kind of parliament and whatever. But then all this news start falling one after each other, and I'm like standing there amazement with no comment. Nothing to say. I'm just bringing you the news about all this. Suddenly, yeah, there's all about, and like people regularly in Russian newspaper coming from France, coming from Denmark, saying, they've legalized pedophilia. They think that there's pedophilia everywhere in Europe, and that people rape the small children, and that there's, the third gender prevails, and that the third gender toilet. They could have it, for instance, as the main news on Russia's news program, Vremya, that there is a third gender toilet somewhere. They have seen in Ukraine. Yes, that they liberated a city in Donbass, and they came to a school there, and in the school in a city in Donbass, there were like 3 toilet doors. There was 1 door for male, 1 for female, and 1 for the indefinite gender, for the third gender. And then there was, Jesus Christ, it was a 10-minute video on a Russian main news channel saying, this must be the Western instructors that have, taught Ukrainians. So our goal is to liberate Ukrainians from this Western perversion so that there are boys and girls and there's men and women and they give birth to a healthy generation. So I wouldn't believe 2 or 3 years ago, I wouldn't believe myself I would say if I would be saying this, telling this to you. That's true. That's what I get daily from the news. So yeah, so Russia is, as usual, it's like a mixture of blood and absurd, a mixture of torture and parody. So we've seen it from Russian literature. We've seen it from the novels of Dostoevsky. But now it came to life and it's threatening to kill our world. So that's unfortunately the case. Okay, was this solemn conclusion? Yeah. I think unless there are further questions. Yes, people. Yeah. Some thanks coming from the audience there. Okay, thanks for everyone following on the internet. If there's anyone left there, thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was great.